Welcome to the deep dive. So this time you've really given us something global to chew on, a huge collection of sources on major historical conflicts.
Yeah, literally spanning every continent. 10 major ones from each. That's quite a list.
It really is.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's unpack this. It's ambitious, right?
Yeah,
Our mission today is basically to give you a whirlwind tour, but an insightful one.
right. Not get lost in the weeds.
Exactly. We want to pull out the surprising facts, the key moments, maybe some themes that connect them without getting bogged down in, like, every single battle plan.
Sort of a high-level understanding, a cheat sheet, maybe?
Yeah, think of it like that. Your cheat sheet to a more connected view of global conflict.
Makes sense. And looking at this list, what really hits you is just the sheer variety of human experience here. We're talking ideologies shifting, maps being redrawn.
The birth of nations, often painful.
Totally. It just shows how conflict, like it or not, has been this massive force shaping everything. Destructive, yeah, but definitely formative. So true. So with this huge pile of information, where do we even start? Maybe continent by continent. How about Africa?
Sounds good. The list you provided for Africa is mostly more recent, relatively speaking,
Yeah.
late 20th century onwards.
Right. And the Second Congo War jumps out immediately. Africa's World War. They call
Yeah,
it.
that's a heavy title.
Yep.
9 nations involved, tons of different armed groups, and the estimated death toll.
Hmm.
It's just, wow.
5.4 million. It's hard to even comprehend.
And what's really, significant about that number is most weren't actually killed in fighting.
Right. It was the aftermath, disease, starvation.
Exactly. Which tells you a lot about modern warfare, doesn't it? The
Mhm.
indirect consequences, the humanitarian crises, they can dwarf the actual battlefield casualties. It shows
Okay.
how conflict just rips apart the systems people rely on.
That's a really important point. Okay, then there's the Chaco War, Bolivia and Paraguay. This one feels kind of counterintuitive.
How so?
Well, Bolivia had the bigger army, better equipment,
Right,
right?
right.
You'd think they'd win. Yeah. But Paraguay pulled off the victory. It's a classic example, really, that being bigger and better equipped on paper isn't everything.
So what made the difference? Terrain? Morale?
Probably a mix. Adapting to the environment. That Chaco region is brutal. And maybe, yeah, a stronger national drive makes you think about those less tangible factors like local knowledge, strategic thinking.
Definitely. Okay, moving on. The Ethiopian Civil War. Big changes there. Overthrow of Haile Selassie.
Right. Leading to a Marxist-Leninist state shows how deep ideological divides can just tear a country apart, leading to years of, well, brutal conflict.
And Liberia.
Yeah.
Just tragic. 2 civil wars back to back almost.
Yeah, the Liberian situation really highlights that awful, cyclical nature conflict can sometimes fall into. You think it's over, but the instability is still there, and it flares up again. Over 250,000 deaths across both wars, massive displacement.
Devastating. And then Rwanda. The civil war there led directly into the 1994 genocide.
A horrific escalation. Around 800,000 people, mostly Tutsi and moderate Hutu, killed in such a short time. It forces you to confront, well, the absolute horror of ethnic hatred when it goes unchecked, and the failures, frankly, of the international community to stop it.
A very dark chapter. What about the Angolan Civil War? That went on for ages after independence.
It did, 1975, right up to 2002. It's a prime example of how post-colonial situations got tangled up in the Cold War. The MPLA and UNITA, backed by different global powers, it just fueled the internal conflict for decades. 500,000 estimated deaths.
So the Cold War's shadow looms large there. Now, looking at the more recent ones on the list for Africa.
Yeah.
Darfur, Somalia, these are still ongoing, right?
Pretty much, yeah. Darfur since 2003, Somalia arguably since 91. They're not history yet. They show how complex modern conflicts are: government forces, rebels, ethnic militias, external actors sometimes.
And human cost just continues.
Absolutely. In Somalia, the lack of a strong central government created this power vacuum, right? And groups like Al-Shabaab stepped in, perpetuating the chaos. It raises big questions about, what happens when state structures collapse.
Yeah, that's crucial. And the Biafran War in Nigeria, that was a secession attempt.
Right, 1967 to 1970. And what's tragically remembered there is the famine. It became a weapon of war, essentially, blocking aid, causing widespread starvation. Around 1 million deaths. A brutal reminder of the humanitarian cost of political conflict.
God, yeah. And finally for Africa, Sierra Leone. Another civil war known for just extreme brutality.
Yeah, 1991 to 2002, infamous for the use of child soldiers, the blood diamonds funding the conflict, widespread atrocities, over 50,000 deaths. Just a chilling example of how far things can degrade.
Okay, quite a heavy start in Africa. Let's jump across the Atlantic. North America, different flavor here, definitely. Colonial era stuff, Cold War.
And obviously the American Civil War looms large, 1861 to 65.
Can't overstate its importance, really.
Right.
Primarily over slavery, resulted in over 600,000 deaths.
And fundamentally changed the U.S. abolition, preserving the Union. It really tested the whole idea of the nation. Shows how deep those moral and social fissures can run.
Yeah. Then, the Mexican-American War, that was more about territory.
Absolutely. Mid-1840s led to the U.S. acquiring huge swaths of land, California, Arizona, New Mexico.
Basically reshaped the map of the continent.
Completely. Had massive lasting impacts on demographics, culture, everything.
The War of 1812.
Yeah.
That one feels a bit different, less decisive.
Well, yeah, it ended pretty much where it started, status quo antebellum. But it wasn't insignificant. It really helped forge a stronger American national identity, kind of push Britain back a bit more in North America.
So victory isn't always about grabbing land.
Exactly. Sometimes it's about solidifying who you are.
Interesting. Spanish-American War, 1898. Short, sharp.
Very. But big consequences. U.S. defeats Spain, gets Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, marks America stepping onto the world stage as a major power, an imperial one, really.
And that leads us towards the Cold War era, right?
Yeah.
That long standoff between the U.S. and Soviet Union.
Yeah, 1947 to 91, roughly. No direct, massive war between the big two, thankfully, but it shaped everything. Alliances, proxy wars.
Like Vietnam and Korea.
Exactly. Devastating conflicts fueled by that larger ideological struggle. Vietnam, 1955 to 75, huge U.S. involvement, incredibly divisive, millions dead. Korea, 1950 to 53, international intervention ends in a stalemate that still divides the peninsula today. Tragic outcomes.
And the Cuban Missile Crisis fits in there too, doesn't it? That moment the world held its breath.
October 62, 13 days. The absolute closest we came to nuclear annihilation. A terrifying reminder of what the Cold War really meant at its peak.
Yeah, chillin'. The Panama Canal Zone conflict, that's an interesting one. Not really a war, more like decades of tension.
Right. From the U.S. building the canal in the early 1900s right up to handing it back in 99. It highlights that constant friction that can happen over strategic assets, like vital waterways. Control means power, and that causes tension.
Makes sense. And lastly, for North America, you included the Haitian Revolution.
Had to. 1791 to 1804. It's monumental.
The first successful slave revolt leading to an independent nation.
Exactly. The first independent Black Republic. An incredible story of fighting for freedom against overwhelming odds. It sent shockwave through the whole system of slavery and colonialism at the time. A really powerful moment of resistance.
Absolutely. Okay, let's shift focus again. Europe, a continent just steeped in history and, well, a lot of conflict.
That's putting it mildly. Where do we anchor ourselves? Maybe the English Civil War, mid-17th century?
Good starting point. Then obviously the big ones, World War I and World War II. Just transformative on a global scale.
Unimaginably devastating. WWWI 1914-18 shattered empires, redrew maps, but also kind of set the stage for WWII in some ways.
Yeah, the Treaty of Versailles and all that.
Right. And WWII 39 to 45. The deadliest conflict in human history. Over 100 million people involved directly. The sheer scale of destruction, the Holocaust, it changed everything.
Yeah.
Led to the UN, the idea of trying to prevent something like that ever again.
A stark lesson in humanity's capacity for destruction.
Yeah.
And maybe for learning afterwards.
We hope so. Sandwiched between those, you've got the Napoleonic Wars, early 1800s.
Also hugely impactful. Napoleon marching across Europe, spreading revolutionary ideas, even unintentionally shaking up the old order.
Yeah, redrew the political map again, changed the balance of power significantly. These big European wars really had ripple effects everywhere.
Going further back, the 30 Years' War, 17th century. Sounds brutal.
It was incredibly destructive, especially in Central Europe. The Holy Roman Empire started partly over religion, but became a massive political power struggle, huge loss of life, economic devastation. But it also sort of led towards the modern state system we recognize, based more on territory and sovereignty than just religion. So, a painful transition. Then there's this long series, the Russo-Turkish Wars, spanning centuries.
Literally centuries, from the 16th century right up to WWI. 12 major wars between the Russian and Ottoman empires. It's this epic, long-term rivalry.
And generally Russia gaining ground.
Pretty much. It tracks the rise of Russia and the gradual decline of Ottoman power, especially in the Balkans and around the Black Sea. Shows how these deep historical currents can just play out over vast stretches of time.
And the Great Turkish War in the late 1600s fits into that.
Yeah, that was a key phase. The Ottomans versus the Holy League coalition of European powers. Big Ottoman losses, especially in Hungary. Another step in that shifting balance.
Okay, that's Europe covered at speed. Let's head east. Asia. Again, a huge canvas.
Then you have to start with the Mongol conquests, right?
Hmm.
13th, 14th centuries.
It's absolutely massive. Genghis Khan, his successors, forging the largest contiguous land empire ever. And the devastation, I mean, some historians rank it among the deadliest military campaigns in history. Wiped out entire cities, populations, but also, paradoxically, created this huge zone of trade and communication for a while, the Pax Mongolica.
Complex legacy, then. Destruction and connection.
Very much so.
Okay, fast forward quite a bit. Second Sino-Japanese War.
Yeah.
1937 to 45.
Brutal. Merged into WWII, the Nanjing Massacre, just horrific atrocities, and the death toll for China, estimated over 20 million.
Staggering numbers. It was incredibly brutal, total war, huge civilian suffering, and the memory of it, while it still heavily influences relations in East Asia today,
Yeah,
these historical wounds run deep.
understandably. We touched on Vietnam and Korea earlier, but from the Asian perspective.
Right. These weren't just Cold War proxies happening somewhere else. This was the region being torn apart.
Yeah.
Millions dead in Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and
Mhm.
Korea remain divided, a constant, painful reminder of that conflict.
The human cost right there on the ground. Then the Chinese Civil War, another pivotal one. Yeah, roughly 1927 to 49, with a pause during the war with Japan, nationalists versus communists, Mao Zedong's victory, the founding of the People's Republic, the nationalists retreating to Taiwan, fundamentally reshaped China and the entire region.
And continues to have geopolitical relevance today. What about the Afghan wars? That seems like a recurring theme across centuries.
It really is. From the Anglo-Afghan wars in the 19th century, the great game between Britain and Russia through the Soviet invasion in the 80s, and then the U.S.-led intervention after 2001, Afghanistan's been at the crossroads of empires and ideologies for so long.
A tragic history of external interference and internal conflict.
Vividly illustrates that cycle, yeah. Then there's the Sino-Indian War, 1962. Interesting case.
Why is that?
It was short, over a border dispute. China won decisively on the battlefield, but then just withdrew back behind their lines mostly.
So the territory issue wasn't really resolved.
Nope. Still a point of contention today. Highlights how military victory doesn't always translate into lasting political resolution.
Right. Bangladesh Liberation War, 1971.
Yeah, East Pakistan fighting for independence from West Pakistan. Huge refugee crisis, brutal crackdown. Then India intervened militarily. Led to the creation of Bangladesh.
A successful war for national liberation then, but at a terrible cost.
Absolutely. Millions displaced, hundreds of thousands, possibly more, killed. A significant redrawing of the map in South Asia.
Going way back,
Yeah.
Japanese invasions of Korea, late 1500s.
Right. Under Toyotomi Hideyoshi, Japan tried to conquer Korea, push into China. Years of intense fighting, Korea devastated. But ultimately, with Chinese help, Japan was repelled. Shows those long-standing regional power dynamics.
And finally for Asia, the Taiping Rebellion, mid-19th century China. The death toll estimates are just astronomical.
Yeah, 20 to 30 million deaths. It's almost impossible to grasp. A massive civil war against the Qing dynasty. It ranks as one of the deadliest conflicts in all of human history, possibly the deadliest civil war ever.
Just shows the sheer scale internal conflict can reach.
Absolutely. Underscores the fragility of even massive empires when facing that kind of internal upheaval.
Okay, wow. Let's move to South America now, starting with the War of the Triple Alliance. Sounds ominous. It was 1864 to 1870. Paraguay versus Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay combined. 3 against 1. How did that end?
Catastrophically for Paraguay. It's considered the deadliest war in South American history. Paraguay lost a huge percentage of its territory and just devastatingly an enormous proportion of its adult male population. Some estimates are over 50%, maybe much higher.
My God. Generations wiped out.
Pretty much. Took the country decades and decades to recover demographically. A truly grim example of total war's impact.
Then the War of the Pacific, late 1870s, early 1880s.
Right. Chile against Bolivia and Peru fought largely over control of mineral-rich territory in the Atacama Desert.
And the outcome.
Chile won, gained that valuable territory, and crucially, Bolivia lost its access to the Pacific Ocean, became landlocked.
Permanently.
Permanently. It's still a major issue for Bolivia today, economically and politically, a lasting geographical consequence of that war.
Wow. Okay, the Colombian armed conflict. This one feels more recent and maybe still simmering.
Yeah, traditionally dated from 1964, involving the government, FARC rebels, other groups like the ELN, paramilitaries. One of the world's longest-running internal conflicts, millions displaced, hundreds of thousands killed.
And there was a peace deal with FARC.
Yes, in 2016, a major step. But there are still ongoing tensions, other armed groups active, difficulties implementing the peace accords. It highlights how deep-rooted these conflicts are and how hard-lasting peace can be to achieve.
Right, the roots go deep. We mentioned the Chaco War earlier, but it's on the South American list too.
Makes sense. It was between Bolivia and Paraguay.
Yeah.
Worth reiterating here that Paraguay won, despite Bolivia having, on paper, the advantage. Shows again that factors beyond just troop numbers and equipment matter.
Okay. Then, Peruvian Civil Wars, just after independence.
Yeah, in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, a period of real instability. Lots of internal fighting between different factions, caudillos, military leaders vying for power.
So typical post-independence struggles.
Pretty common across South America at the time, yeah. Building stable nations out of the former colonies was a messy, often violent process. Peru is a good example of that internal turbulence.
Right. Then we have the actual wars of independence, Brazil, Venezuela.
Absolutely pivotal. Brazil's path to independence from Portugal was relatively less bloody than some, but still involved conflict. Venezuela's, led by Simón Bolívar, was part of those much larger continent-spanning wars against Spain. Epic struggles shaping the modern nations.
And the Cisplatin War, that sounds interesting, led to a new country.
It did, 1825, 1828, fought between Brazil and Argentina over the territory that's now Uruguay. Neither side could really dominate. So, through British mediation, they agreed to create Uruguay as an independent buffer state between them.
Huh. So conflict can actually create new nations sometimes, not just destroy them.
Yeah, geopolitical maneuvering can have unexpected outcomes.
Then, Argentine Civil Wars, another long period of internal struggle.
Very long. On and off from around 1814 to the 1870s. Basically, fights between centralists who wanted a strong government based in Buenos Aires and federalists who wanted more power for the provinces. Really shamed how modern Argentina developed. Nation building through conflict again.
And finally, for South America, Fujimori's dirty war in Peru. That was 1990s.
Yeah. The government's fight against the Shining Path insurgents. Characterized by pretty brutal counterinsurgency tactics, human rights abuses, thousands killed or disappeared on both sides, a much more recent grim chapter.
Okay, last continent, Oceania. Maybe less history of huge land wars, but definitely conflict.
For sure. And World War II is massive here, too. The Pacific Theater.
Right. Huge battles fought across island chains. Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, Japan versus the U.S. and its allies.
Brought the global war right to their doorstep. Devastating impact on many islands, turned them into strategic hotspots overnight, significant loss of life, and changed the geopolitical landscape of the Pacific profoundly.
Then, more recently, the Bougainville Civil War. That was within Papua New Guinea.
Yeah, 1988 to 1998. A separatist conflict on Bougainville Island, driven by disputes over the huge Panguna copper mine and issues of identity and self-determination. Significant death toll, maybe up to 20,000.
Shows that even within relatively new nations, these tensions can erupt. Then we have the colonial conflicts, New Zealand wars, Australian frontier wars.
Right. Mid to late 19th century in New Zealand, Maori tribes fighting against British and colonial forces over land, sovereignty. Very significant for New Zealand's history.
And the Australian frontier wars. That period seems incredibly long.
It really was. Basically from the start of British colonization in 1788 right up into the 1930s in some areas. Not a single war, but a long, drawn-out series of conflicts, massacres, and resistance as colonization spread across the continent. Tens of thousands of Indigenous Australians killed. A deeply traumatic history.
Yeah, the duration itself speaks volumes. East Timor. Held to fight for independence from Indonesia.
Exactly. Indonesia invaded in 1975 after Portugal withdrew. Decades of resistance followed, often brutal repression, finally led to an independence referendum in 1999, and then full independence, a hard-won victory.
Then, Solomon Islands conflict, Fiji coups. These sound like more internal instability issues.
Largely, yeah. Solomon Islands, late 90s, early 2000s, ethnic tensions between groups from different islands led to violence, and an Australian-led peacekeeping mission Ram's Eye.
And Fiji's had multiple coups.
Yeah, 1987, 2000, 2006, driven by complex mix of ethnic tensions, particularly between indigenous Fijians and Indo-Fijians, and political power struggles, caused long-term instability. The recurring nature is striking.
Definitely. What about the Papua conflict? Is that ongoing?
Yes. It refers to the separatist struggle in West Papua, the western half of the island of New Guinea, against Indonesian rule. Started back in the 1960s when Indonesia took control. Low-level conflict, but persistent, with human rights concerns and a significant, though hard-to-verify, death toll over the decades.
So another long-running issue, Tonga riots, 2006, more recent unrest.
Yeah, civil unrest in the capital, Nuku'alofa, sparked by protests pushing for faster democratic reforms, led to significant property damage, highlights that push for political change happening across the region, too.
And lastly, the Samoan Civil War, right at the end of the 19th century. Involved big powers.
It did. Germany, Britain, and the U.S. all got involved, backing rival Samoan factions vying for the kingship. It's a fascinating little microcosm of that peak imperial era where these global powers were interfering even in relatively small island nations competing for influence.
Shows how interconnected things were even then.
Definitely.
Yeah, that was quite the tour. An incredibly rapid journey through, wow, just an enormous amount of history and, frankly, tragedy.
It really is sobering when you lay it out like that. The sheer number, the variety, global wars, civil wars, independence struggles, colonial conflicts.
Yeah, we've hit on so many different types.
Yeah.
And across every single continent, as you provided in the sources.
And you do start to see those recurring themes, don't you? Disputes over land and resources, obviously.
Definitely. Struggles for power, whether it's internal or between nations, ideological clashes.
And that persistent drive for self-determination, for independence, for groups to define their own identity and future.
Yeah, that comes up again and again. Now, obviously, we have to stress this was incredibly high level, like ridiculously fast.
No, absolutely. Each one of these conflicts deserves, books written about it, not just a couple of minutes.
For sure. But hopefully it gives you, the listener, a sense of that vast tapestry. So, considering everything we've just raced through, based on this material, here's something to think about. What underlying human factors do you think keep driving societies to war again and again?
And maybe how has the nature of war itself changed? The scale, the technology, the reasons? Comparing, say, the Mongol conquests to the Somali Civil War.
Exactly. Something to mull over. What are the constants and what are the changes in this long, often brutal history of human conflict? Maybe dive deeper into one or two that really caught your attention.